There are a lot of reading events happening in May. So Sarah over the channel Roadworthy and I have added yet another one. We're calling it Grey in May, and it is intended to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Greywolf Press. Greywolf is one of the leading independent publishers in the United States. They publish absolutely amazing works of fiction and nonfiction and poetry. And I want to celebrate some of the other exciting reading events happening in May by finding Greywolf books that fit those reading events and their prompts. Actually, not their prompts. I haven't tried to fit the specific prompts of any of these reading events, but the general idea of the reading event has helped guide me to pick Greywolf books that fit those reading events. You'll see what I'm talking about. But first, a little bit about Greywolf. If you aren't familiar with Greywolf, you're wrong. You actually are familiar with Greywolf, especially if you're here. Because if you are watching this channel, in all likelihood, you read literary fiction or narrative nonfiction, maybe even poetry, some of you. And therefore, you have for sure encountered Greywolf books before. You might not know it. So Greywolf has published many novels from Percival Everett, though not his most recent novel, James. They published Milkman by Anna Burns, I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel. They've published Carmen Maria Machado, her short story collection and her memoir. They have published Claudia Rankine. They have published Max Porter, all three of his novels, Grief is the Thing with Feathers, Lanny, and Shy. So chances are, if you scroll through Greywolf's catalog, you have at least seen these books around because many of them are award-winning works of literature. I love Greywolf. I love Greywolf. Greywolf is a perfect example of what I have mentioned so many times on this channel, and that is the beauty of exploring books from independent publishers, is that independent publishers are not a large corporation, conglomerate, multinational organization. They are generally much smaller than that. They are small, and they are very often driven by a mission or a particular vision or style or aesthetic. So if you find a book from an independent publisher that you love, you are very likely going to have a lot of luck with the other books that they publish because they are laser focused on their vision or mission or style. You've already demonstrated that you, by loving one book from them, that you like that mission, vision, style that is coming from that publisher. So you're probably going to like more of what they publish. And that is Greywolf for me and for a lot of people. It is a very, very well-known, beloved independent publisher. Greywolf, like I said, publishes award-winning books. If quality, high quality writing is important to you, you will love Greywolf. If big ideas are important to you, if writing that grapples with big ideas from life, it doesn't matter what the big idea is, but big problems, big ideas, you will very likely love Greywolf. Often those big ideas are tackled by authors who are experimenting with form and style. And so if you like books that experiment with form and style, then you are very much gonna like Greywolf books. But they also have amazing storytellers among their authors. So if you are someone, for example, if you are those among us who love short stories and just love a good, beautifully written short story, Greywolf is where it's at. So check out Greywolf, and you can do so through your existing reading plans, potentially. First up is Mental Health May, and Mental Health May is hosted by Kim at Middle of the Book March and Marilyn Maya Mendoza. I will leave the hosts of all of these reading events in the description below. So the first book that I want to share from Greywolf that would fit for Mental Health May is taking the reading event very literally and talking about mental health and mental illness specifically. And that book is The Collected Schizophrenias by Esme Weijun Wang. And this is an essay collection. And it is all about the journey, Wang's journey of diagnosis and living with schizoaffective disorder. And it is a powerful, powerful look at mental illness, at living with mental illness, and at how mental illness is treated in this country. Both, and I mean treated like medically, but also how mental illness is treated by society, by this society. And very specifically schizophrenia, because schizophrenia, when compared to other mental illness, is treated very differently by both the medical community and by society at large. So, such a good book. So I highly recommend this book for potentially for Mental Health May. But actually the theme this year for Mental Health May is self-care. And so taking that theme and thinking about myself, self-care for reading means two things, actually. And specifically, it means taking time to read two things that I deeply enjoy, but I never take the time to read because they are two things that actually do take time. And, I feel like in this space, we're trying to speed through a lot of books to get a lot of content. And so reading something that will take you time is sometimes deprioritized, even if it brings you joy. And for me, that is the two categories. And the first is poetry. Greywolf publishes amazing award-winning poetry. So you could choose any poetry collection from Greywolf and be in good hands if poetry is a form of self-care for you as well. For me, I would pick something, like if I'm really thinking self-care, I would pick something I've read before. That's not efficient, reading something you've read before. You should be reading something you haven't read so you can talk about it. Self-care is revisiting a beloved something. And for me, that would be Post-Colonial Love Poem by Natalie Diaz. And this I've actually read twice already. So it would be the ultimate move, self-care move to read it again. Did she win the Pulitzer Prize? I want to say she won the Pulitzer Prize. Natalie Diaz is amazing. This poetry collection is amazing. I highly recommend it. Take care of yourself. Read some poetry. And the other thing that I never make time for, but something I deeply, deeply love reading, craft, is writing craft books. I just think they're so fun. But I don't know how many people were interested in them, so I hardly ever make time for them. And Greywolf publishes awesome writing books. They have a series specifically called Art of, and it's like art of time. It's like dealing with different things within writing. But the one I have that I've been wanting to read is The Art of Revision by Peter Ho Davies. This would be the ultimate self-care move for me to read a writing craft book in May. Next up, we have Horror Mayhem, and Horror Mayhem was created by the Bookish Bryants and has about 1 billion hosts, which I will not list verbally, but I will list in writing in the description below. Horror Mayhem also has about 1 bajillion different prompts and different reading weeks and all sorts of stuff. So I am just purely going to say horror, what books that could be categorized as horror have been published by Greywolf. And when I initially started thinking about this, the first thing that popped to mind was Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. And this is a collection of short stories that very much dabble in the horror space. And indeed, when I checked the blurb online, the blurb says, in Her Body and Other Parties, Carmen Maria Machado blithely demolishes the arbitrary borders between psychological realism and science fiction, comedy and horror, fantasy and fabulism. I remember my jaw slowly falling to the floor as I read the novella in this book called Especially Heinous, in which Machado reimagines every episode of Law & Order Special Victims Unit in wild, fantastical ways. And I had never, at that point, had never read anything like that. And it just kept going and going and going. And my jaw just kept falling to the floor as I read it, because I was like, I can't believe she's still, right? Like that this is still going. Yeah, it's great. Carmen Maria Machado popped to mind. But then what I did was I went to the website and I typed in horror in the search bar on Greywolf's website, and a bunch of books popped up. Basically, it was pulling from blurbs from different books, like where the word horror was mentioned in the blurb, and 2 stood out. So the first one was called Suicide Woods by Benjamin Percy, and this is a short story collection, and it's described as a potent brew of horror, crime, and weird happenings in the woods. And examples of the stories include a boy in his uncle's care falls through the ice on a pond and emerges in a frozen, uncanny state. A body found on a train and a blood-soaked carpet in an empty house are clues to a puzzling crime in a small town. And then in a pulse-quickening novella, thrill seekers on a mapping expedition into the Bermuda Triangle of remote Alaska are stranded on a sinister island that seems to want them dead. And then another book that popped up is a novel called Castle by J. Robert Lennon. And the reason it popped up was because one of the reviews of this book calls it horror, and it's a review from the Oregonian, and it says a brilliant classical psychological horror story that sticks to and gnaws at the bones. And this is a novel about a man with a shadowy past who purchases like a dilapidated old house in the woods, and as he's renovating it, he starts to explore his property, and specifically the woods on his property, and he finds in the center of his land a Gothic castle that he appears not to own. I don't know exactly what that means, but I'm guessing something supernatural is happening maybe. And the blurb says, the reader is drawn into a taut and mesmerizing story that reveals a great deal not just about one man's past, but about America's recent military misadventures. Then we have Springathon, and Springathon has 4 hosts that I'll list below. There are optional prompts and a group read. It runs from May 3rd to May 19th, and it is specifically focused on nature writing, anything like writing that has to do with the natural world. And a ton of books jumped out from Greywolf that could fit this event, but I picked 3 to talk about. The first is a brand new book that's coming out that I think could kind of maybe fit. So it's called The Tree Doctor by Marie Mitsuki Mockett. And this is a story of an unnamed narrator, a woman who moves to California to care for her mother. And she leaves her family behind. Her family is in Hong Kong. She moves to California to care for her mother. Her mother is then moved to a care facility, and this narrator is left at her mother's home and becomes obsessed with a cherry tree in her mother's garden. And then the blurb goes on to say, caught between tending to an unwell parent and the weight of obligation to her distant daughters and husband, she becomes isolated and unmoored. She soon starts a torrid affair with an arborist who is I'm guessing the tree doctor, who is equally fascinated by her mother's garden, and together they embark on reviving the garden. Increasingly engrossed by the garden and by the awakening of her own body, she comes to see her mother's illness as part of a natural order in which things are perpetually living and dying, consuming and being consumed. All the while, she struggles to teach remotely. I think this takes place during the pandemic. So she's struggling to teach remotely Lady Murasaki's 11th century novel, The Tale of Genji, which turns out to resonate eerily with the conditions of contemporary society in the grip of a pandemic. Then we have a book called Elixir in the Valley at the End of Time by Kapka Kasabova. And this is a book about the author exploring a river valley and the surrounding forests and mountains of the Mesta River, which is one of the oldest rivers in Europe. And it's in the southern Balkans, and it's the home to a rich culture of plant gatherers. And the author, as the blurb says, meets women and men who work in a long lineage of foragers, healers, and mystics. She learns about wild plants and the ancient practice of herbalism that makes use of them, and she experiences a symbiotic system where nature and culture have blended for thousands of years. And through her captivating encounters, we come to feel the devastating weight of the ecological and cultural disinheritance that the people of this valley have suffered. And finally, for Springathon, we have Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist and Other Essays by Paul Kingsnorth. Kingsnorth was once an activist and ardent environmentalist, but, as the blurb says, as the environmental movement began to focus on sustainability rather than the defense of wild places for their own sake, and as global conditions worsened, he grew disenchanted with the movement he once embraced, and he gave up once what he saw as the false hope that the residents of the first world would ever make the kind of sacrifices that might avert the severe consequences of climate change. And so these essays are full of grief and fury, as well as passionate and lyrical evocations of nature and the wild. He articulates a new vision that he calls dark ecology, which stands firmly in opposition to the belief that technology can save us, and he argues for a renewed balance between the human and non-human worlds. So that sounds honestly rather depressing, which leads us perfectly into our final reading event, which is Misery May, of course. Misery May is hosted by Scott at Gunpowder Fiction and Plot and Gemma at Gem of Books. A lot of writers are preoccupied with miserable things, so I didn't need to look far. A couple of these books I'm listing for a reason, which you'll find out at the end. First up is Brickmakers by Selva Almada. This is a novel, and it's translated from Spanish by Annie McDermott, and it opens with two characters dying. So misery from the get-go. So this is a novel about the patriarchs of it's a novel about two families of brickmakers, and the patriarchs of these two families have been feuding for years. They've hated each other for years. But the two of the teenage sons from these two families fall in love. Brickmakers opens with two young men, one from each family, who lie dying in the mud at the base of a Ferris wheel. And the blurb says, inhabiting a dreamlike state between life and death, they recall the events that forced them to pay the price of their father's petty feud. Then I also thought I would highlight The Empathy Exams by Leslie Jamison, and this is possibly one of my favorite essay collections of all time. It's quite brilliant, and it is completely miserable. There are a lot of miserable people depicted in this book, and that is because Leslie Jamison is studying empathy. And in order to talk about empathy, she first has to tell the stories of people that would elicit an empathic response. People who are deeply miserable. So these are stories highlighting everything from illness to incarceration to violence to poverty. It's brilliant and at times quite miserable. And finally, a book that illustrates perhaps my favorite treatment of misery within fiction, and that's misery plus humor, maybe with a little bit of hope added in at the end. And that is Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. And yeah, this is a novella, very, very short book. This is the story of a father and his two sons who are grieving the very, very recent loss of their wife and mother. Sudden loss. And in the very, very early days of their grief, Crow shows up on their doorstep. And basically, Crow forces himself into their lives and guides them through their grief. They are miserable, but this is also very funny and ridiculous. And there, I think, is a good amount of hope woven in here as well. And I think that's my favorite way to have misery in a book. I don't know, how else do you deal with misery? You need a bit of humor in your life. I hope you have a fabulous month of reading, no matter what you decide to read. I'm going to have a real hard time picking what Greywolf books I want to read in May, but I know for certain 5 specific books that I'm going to be reading in May from Greywolf for sure. And I've mentioned a few of those 5 books already in this video. And if you want to know what those 5 books are, then I highly suggest you watch the next video that will be popping up here any minute now. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Sarah. I'll talk to you later. Bye.